Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. As per usual, sorry for the mess back here. That's just the way my space is. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of space. So everything gets crowded in the background. Anyhow, I'm really excited, really enjoying Historathon 2023. Yes, my hair is wet again. I have a habit of recording booktube after taking a shower, so I have time for my hair to dry before bed. So this apparently is the booktube look for me. Anyhow, I've been really enjoying taking part in Historathon 2023 thus far. I've been really enjoying discovering or rediscovering other booktubers who enjoy reading history, adding them on to other booktubers that I currently enjoy. Drink of water. I do not have tea tonight because I perhaps should make sure I get some sleep tonight. Okay. Anyhow, as per usual, I have no real plan. I'm just going to sort of wing it. First things first, I guess what I have read thus far. Actually, I think I did write perhaps some stuff down. I tried taking notes or starting to take notes, but I didn't get very far. Just because I get distracted. I started off with Historathon with several books because I never start with one. I started with the idea that I wanted to read Domina, but I already had a book started. I think I actually, even though I hadn't started it yet, or I barely started it, it was shorter. So I was like, well, I'll read this book on the Hittites first, and then I will read the book Domina, which I've been wanting to read for a while. I'm just going to pull it up on my story graph so I can try to give you all details in case you wonder, which book among however many books on the Hittites are you speaking of? Let's see. Oh, probably just easier to go to my stats. Okay. So the book that I chose on the Hittites, oh, that's right, it would be under there. Okay. It's Hittites, a captivating guide to the ancient Anatolian people who established the Hittite Empire in ancient Mesopotamia. Yes, that is in fact the entire title. Okay, to be fair, Hittites is probably the title, and the rest of that is the subtitle. You know how in old books, particularly quite old books, you would have like these run-on sentence titles? That's what that makes me think of. And I can't bring it to mind right now, an old book that would do that, but I know they were out there because looking at those titles were always hilarious. It's like, okay, catch your breath. Leave some of it for what's going to be between the covers. But that's what this book is about. It was 94 pages long, and you'd think 94 pages would go pretty quickly. And there was some, pretty interesting stuff in there. I don't know, or I haven't known, still don't feel like I know a whole lot about the Hittites. But this book was actually, it didn't go as quickly as I hoped it would. I mean, the stuff that I did get out of it was very interesting. And I actually found it to dovetail nicely with my chosen historical fiction book that I picked to read around the same time period, because my goal is to do my own little historical fiction read along to coincide with the Historathon and keep the timeline the same. So when I'm doing, for the first quarter, prehistory to 500 AD for nonfiction, I will be doing the same for my historical fiction and try to keep that theme going, because I generally avoid historical fiction. I tend to prefer actual history books because I am very picky about my historical fiction. I don't like if the time doesn't feel genuine. I don't like if modern sensibilities or modern language, just a modern feel is put upon this time period. I want to be able to lose myself in that time period and to feel like it is genuine. Also, if it's not done well, I don't want to have words placed into the mouths of famous figures in history. It has to be done really well, and it's very rare that I find it done in a way that I enjoy. But that being said, I did enjoy having the Hittites running simultaneously with the Heretic Queen, which is and I think I talked about this last video, it is a historical fiction about Nefertari, who is the blood niece of Nefertiti. Nefertiti? Nefertiti. Yeah. Nefertiri. Nefertiti. It's Nefertiti, excuse me. All these Nefers. Anyway, Nefertiti, who was the heretic king Akhenaten's wife. So it was very interesting because you do have the Hittites coming into things, and some things just would be like, oh yeah, I remember that coming up. Oh yeah, that makes sense. So certain things clicked a little bit more because I was reading about the Hittites in an actual historical book at the same time. Now, the Heretic Queen, I breezed through like that. I found it very enjoyable. I couldn't put it down, much like when I read Hunger Games for the first time. Just couldn't put the thing down. Had to finish it. Wish I could say the same thing about the Hittites. And the Hittites was much shorter. Heretic Queen, I believe, was 300, 400 pages. Hittites was 96 pages. Hittites, I don't know if it was an editing issue. I don't know what was going on here. Initially, I thought that it was a me problem. I thought, oh, I'm falling asleep and I'm going back a couple pages and I just keep reading over the same part over and over again because this is something that happens to me. I have chronic fatigue and I will think I've moved forward in a book and will not have actually done so. But it kept happening. So I started paging back. Okay, I thought I read that earlier. Maybe I didn't. Well, it turned out that I was. The writing was so uninspired that they were using they're expressing the same idea in almost identical verbiage, which is just poor writing. For one thing, if there's another way to say it, choose that. And for another thing, it's just repetitive. And I don't mean just like repetitive as you're using the same words. I mean, you're repeating the same concepts. Move on. Unless you're adding something new to the conversation, continue. Otherwise, this is just padding. And to be padding a 96-page book, you're doing something wrong. I really did want to finish the book, but I found it to be a slog. It ended up going to my DNF pile. And I hate to have a DNF so early in the year, especially since I really wanted to finish this one. This is the first time I can literally say, and I don't use literally lightly because I hate literally being used figuratively. But I literally was brought to tears of boredom from this book. Now, it could have been just also that I was having a flare at the time. But I was also that bored too. So I can actually say this book bored me to tears. Stopped it, threw it in DNF, and I got to start Domina. I've heard many good things about Domina, or I've heard good things about Domina. Someone just commented in one of my recent videos. I haven't had a chance to respond to her yet, but she mentioned that she really enjoyed Domina. I've had someone else in the comments say that it's a popular choice. I am enjoying it thus far. I haven't gotten terribly far where we're talking. We just started talking a little bit more about Livia. So that's good. Now we're starting to get into the personalities. I have a minor issue, and we'll see if this gets addressed more later on. And I always have a problem if everything gets ascribed to misogyny. And I absolutely acknowledge that that was a time period where this definitely was an issue. But I do take issue with the idea that the double standard regarding promiscuity was purely because of misogyny. Do I believe that's part of the issue? Yes. Do I believe that was even the primary issue? No. And this is why. Particularly for, well, anytime you have anything with inheritance, even if you don't have kings, like the Romans had a big issue with kings. You know, if you had a whiff of kingship, you know, there would be a revolt. So the emperors had to tread very softly and be very tricksy about it. But even if you didn't have that kind of inheritance going on, you still had to have inheritance of land, inheritance of all these other things. And a lot of times these kind of things were based off of blood relationships. Well, a lot of times these things were only granted to legitimate issue. So if you didn't, how would you know whether or not a child was legitimate? It wasn't just of your wife's bloodline, but also of your own, if that was your preference to pass this on to your own bloodline. Well, you'd have to be pretty darn certain that she was only having relations with you within your marriage. So, yes, it was partially, most likely, a double standard based on some misogyny, but there were actual practical reasons for wanting to keep the marriage, to keep the women in particular pure within their marriage, because then you have muddying of the waters of, well, you know, is this my son or is this not my son? Is this, you know, the son of some, you know, slave, some freeborn, or some freed slave, some, you know, random worker who I don't consider worthy of having this land, or whatever it is that was meant to be inherited. I mean, because you got to remember, I think it was Caesar they mentioned at some point in the book, made a point of tracking his family line all the way back to Venus. If that's so important to you that you want to track your family line back to the gods, don't you want to make sure that that child you think is your own is actually your own? I mean, I know that they did adopt people into their family, like Octavian did for, oh, my brain is just completely going on me. I can see his name in my head. It's gone. It'll come to my brain later. Livia's son. Nope, not that name either. It'll come later. I'm sure it will. Anyway, he adopted. My brain is just completely not present right now, and it's going to bother me until I look it up. Okay, that's what his name I was thinking of. Tiberius. So Tiberius wasn't Octavian's blood issue, but he chose to adopt him, and I know that when a man was adopted, they took on the bloodline of the adopter. Yeah, adopter. Yeah, D took on the adoptee, took on the bloodline of the adopter. So I know it wasn't quite the same as in, like, the English monarchy, but it was enough of an issue, because they were even talking at one point in the book about how they didn't care if the men slept around as long as it didn't affect the bloodline. Well, wouldn't that be doubly, triply so for the women, where, you know, guys, you can, you know, the guys, with the women, you knew, okay, this is obviously the issue of her body. So as long as she's keeping faithful to her marriage, then you know that there's only one place that child could have come from. But if there were other partners, then there's no idea of where that child could come from. Versus, obviously, for the guy, I mean, he could have like 20 million children throughout the city and he might not even know. But, so I think it would be much more of an issue for the inheritance in the bloodline to keep an eye on the purity and the monogamy of the women in particular. So that made sense to me. I felt like more attention should have been brought to that rather than focusing on the misogyny. Now, that being said, I am still very early on the book. It's probably too early to be coming so strong on this issue, but I have a personal bugbear when a response so early on will come, well, this is misogyny. Well, is it though? Is it a double standard solely because of that? Or are there other factors? Because, I don't know, things aren't usually just that black and white. I mean, sometimes they are. But I don't think that this particular issue is. Now, I do like something. Now, this book does do something I do really like. And I do want to emphasize I don't hate this book so far. I'm really enjoying it. This is just a personal rant that I always have had issue with. But I do like the fact they say, yes, women could not hold public office. And in ways, this could be very limiting because they didn't have a voice in the same way the men did. And that's just documented fact. But they talked about the fact that because they didn't have these offices, they also didn't have the limitations of these offices. And so in some ways that they had freedoms and ways to work around the system the way that the men didn't. And I look forward to seeing this particular idea further developed throughout this book, because I do think we see this in Livia, I think it's Agrippina. I think it's Agrippina the Younger that we see that in. So we see that in several of the women where they manage to work the system just by using, their brains, using what God gave them, and just making the system work for them in a way that they might not have been able to if they had been men instead. So I do like that is a concept that's going to be addressed, because I haven't actually heard that concept addressed. Now, to be fair, most of my research into ancient Rome has either been great courses classes or has been there was a podcast series out a while back, and it was about women in ancient Rome. His first one was the Queens of England podcast. I can't remember what he called the one on Rome, but that guy did a really good podcast. If you ever want to search him out, I wish I could remember his name, but the first one he did was Queens of England podcast. But his series on Roman women really was what got me interested in finding out more about these people that I hadn't really learned that much about previously, which is what made me pick up the book Domina in the first place. So I do look forward to seeing how this book develops, particularly on the women who I'm not as familiar with. Because I feel like Agrippina is more well known, even Livia is more well known, Messalina, but I'm interested in hearing about some of the other stories that I'm not as familiar with. So that'll be fun. I don't think I wrote anything else on this particular one. Oh, yeah, it's, I did get bothered a smidge about, there was a mention of it being kind of weird and disturbing how St. Augustine, had kind of spoken of the abuse that his mother had. Well, first of all, context. Augustine is brought up to say, like, look, there was this, abuse towards women was an accepted thing back then. Women just were experiencing misogyny back then. And they give an example of even as late as Augustine, you would see like this weird, I'm not sure quite how they put it, almost like elevating of the abuse that his mom underwent. And that bothered me a bit because Augustine, this is Augustine of Hippo, considered a doctor of the church in the Catholic Church. I think he's, I'm not sure if other Christian branches consider him a doctor. I'm not sure. But for Augustine, he's not saying, oh, my father did a great job in beating my mother. That's so awesome of him. She should have dealt with that, she's a horrible person. And that's just what women are supposed to do. No, he was emphasizing that her fortitude and her sweet nature, for lack of a better term, eventually brought his father around from being this really vicious person who, made everyone else's husbands in her circle look like saints, brought this really vicious person around to eventually being converted to Christianity before he died. And that was all because of Monica, who's Augustine's mother. And Monica was no, wilting flower. She wasn't just she wasn't a wallflower. She wasn't a rug you could just walk all over. She was playing a long game. And she is who Augustine did credit with his conversion process. I know the Catholic Church credits her. I'm sure other branches do too. I can only speak from the end that I know. She is credited with his conversion because she would never give up on him. She would either chase him around or she would basically beat on heaven's doors for him. And she was very influential, and the idea that he would kind of have like this weird, I don't know, to speak about the abuse his mother experienced in a way that as if it was her due or as if it was some sort of a good thing, the abuse itself was some sort of good thing, is a mistaken idea of what Augustine stood for. Augustine was speaking about a whole different sphere, and I thought it was perhaps not the best place to put that particular example. I think I understand what they were going for, that this was a different time, that misogyny was an issue, but I think choosing Augustine as an example of this was a poor choice. Because Augustine in another section talks about how a man wanting to perform matricide and wanting to do physical harm to his mother in these horrible ways was absolutely forbidden by the church. I was just looking through his writings before recording this, just to make sure that confirm what I already knew instinctually. So this was not something that was like, yeah, this is great, let's go beat the women because that's what they deserve. Were there some, ideas that possibly wouldn't fly now? Yeah, sure, but I think that they did not place that in the proper context. So, maybe I misunderstood the context they intended to put it in, but it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Again, this isn't Slam and Dumb. I am looking forward to the rest of the book. This is just one of those things that kind of gets under my skin and always has, because, yeah. Anyhow, so that's Domina. I'm not very far along. I look forward to continuing farther along on Livia. She's only been married a little while. Cleopatra died yet? I think Cleopatra just died, so very early on. I don't think we even have any of the issues with Julia yet. So, yes, very much looking forward to that. I also have started... Oh, I don't think I mentioned, I have a tendency to pick up history books that do focus on the biographies of women, possibly for whatever reason, that is an interest area of mine. I'm not actively avoiding biographies on masculine figures in history. It's just what I've seen to be drawn towards in certain periods of history. So the one I listened to and did finish was Boudica. And the book, I need to pull it up because it was actually an audiobook, and I borrowed it from the library. Let's go back to my books read. Okay, so it's Boudica, Warrior Woman of Roman Britain, and it's by Caitlin G. Gillespie. And I enjoyed it. It was a solid book. Now, I'm not sure how much more I would have gotten out of it if I had been less fatigued, but I did enjoy while I was listening to it. I thought that they did a good job talking about how the biases of the different writers affected the narrative that you saw. So where Tacitus's narrative might differ from another ancient writer's narrative, based what they wanted you to see about womanhood, what they wanted you to see about Rome, what they wanted you to see about the Roman provinces. So I thought it was interesting how they chose to put certain words in Boudica's mouth, because of course they weren't there. Well, maybe that's not of course, but these men were not there. Most of them, it was for both of them, I believe, it was quite a while after the revolts with Boudica that they were even beginning to write. So they were not present. They were speaking from what they had heard and then taking a little bit of creative license to get their message across. And it was really interesting how they chose to use Boudica in that way. It was interesting how Boudica has been, throughout the years, co-opted by different groups to be their figurehead. I had already known that there had been the statue that was made with Boudica and her two daughters in the chariot that was created. I want to say that was in Victorian England, because I seem to remember Albert wanting that made. And I thought I read, it was in a book that I read last year about Queen Victoria. I think that he had commissioned it or wanted the face to resemble Victoria's, because, and it was a young Victoria, because that was kind of how he wanted her to be seen as. That's what I recall anyhow. But it's a very powerful image if you've seen pictures of that statue. So yeah, I do think that Boudica's story is interesting. I particularly like that they went into so many aspects of not only the British culture, but what the stories told, said about the tellers. So, very interesting book. I do wonder if I had read it instead of listened to it, if I would have gotten more out of it, if I had been more awake, I definitely would have gotten more out of it if I had been more awake. But I can always borrow it again, should I choose to do so. So yeah, that was Boudica. And then the other the other history book that I am currently reading is an old one of mine. I picked this up a while back. I had one of the early Great Courses classes that I had enjoyed was one on ancient Egypt by Bob Brier. And I think I remember mentioning last time how I got into ancient Egypt, which was actually, through fiction. But yeah, so I picked up this book because I so enjoyed the lectures by the professor from the Great Courses that when I saw that he had a book or two, I picked up this one. I want to say I picked up another one too, but this is the one I kept. And it's The Murder of Tutankhamun, King Tut, and it's by Bob Brier, PhD. And I think I had stated last time that there are multiple points of view on whether or not King Tut was murdered. I believe that the prevalent point of view right now is that he wasn't, but I'm not completely up to date on on those kind of things. I've kind of transitioned more into English history and away from my roots of ancient Egypt, so I'm definitely not up to date anymore. I'm glad that I decided to pick this up. I am enjoying it. I don't think I've ever gotten this far in the book before. I always have stopped for one reason or another. Probably partially because I was trying to read this not long after finishing nursing school, and honestly it was really hard to get back into reading after finishing nursing school. It was very hard to want to read anything that was not like fluffy or relaxing. But he is covering something that for me is interesting. So we haven't even reached King Tut himself at this point. We're going through his ancestors, and we've just hit his father, who used to be Amenhotep the Fourth? I think he's Amenhotep the Fourth, but he's more commonly known as Akhenaten. And I've always been fascinated by Akhenaten. I do intend to read, hopefully during this period of time, an actual book on Akhenaten himself. Fun fact, Agatha Christie wrote a play on Akhenaten. I had seen it on thrift books for good price, and I let it pass me by. I'm so mad at myself now. But anyway, I've always been fascinated with Akhenaten because he was the one Egyptian pharaoh who just was like, okay, I know we've been doing the polytheistic thing forever. I'm going monotheistic. We're all now going to worship Aten, the sun disk. And yeah, that's what we're doing now. And it just completely turned everything that ancient Egypt was about just upside down just during his reign. To the point that when he passed, images of him were just, the faces were scratched out. They tried to erase that he even existed, because if there was no image of him, it kind of I don't want to use I don't want to use what sounds like a swear word, but it would doom him in the afterlife. There, I'll say it that way. It would doom him in the afterlife because they would not know what he looked like. So by scratching out his image, it would erase his memory and his future in the world on Earth, and then of course the gods would not be able to recognize him in the afterlife. They really hated him, and this comes out in the Heretic Queen, that historical fiction I was talking about. So it all ties together. But I hit the part where they are where Bob Breer, however he pronounces it, is talking about some of the theories related to Akhenaten. And I've always found this interesting as well. If you're familiar with the artwork with Akhenaten, it's very odd. And actually, I'm not really quite sure how so much of it survives. They'll probably address it in here. But I guess there must have been a part of it somehow must have been preserved, hidden away, maybe part of a tomb fell in, something, because they were scratching out his image. I mean, it's shocking we have as many images of him as we do. But if you look at images of him, he looks deformed. He's got an elongated head, he's got, long limbs, he's really thin, and his facial shape is odd. Now, there are multiple theories about what's going on here. Is this an art form? Well, it never showed up previous, and it never showed up after. But I mean, neither did monotheism. Okay, so is this something that... there's some theories that this is an art form. There's been talk that, well, maybe he actually had a medical condition. And they throw around several different medical conditions. But the one that seems to get the most traction is a medical condition called Marfan syndrome. Marfan syndrome does have the characteristics mentioned, but then did his whole family have Marfan syndrome? Because Nefertiti looks that way as well. Now, I'm not sure how Nefertiti, and again, this might come up, I just might not have reached it yet, is related to him. I know a lot of times they would marry their sister or they would marry a close relative. So maybe she was a close relative and shared the same genes, because with Marfan syndrome, this is a hereditary condition. So it wasn't like it was contagious. He could just like give it to people. No, it was something that would go through the bloodline. That's why you could have possibly seen it pass on to his children, including King Tut. But could that be, it didn't show up in his family ahead of time. All the artwork before that looked great. And then after that looked great. Actually, the Egyptians were more likely to show themselves as younger and better looking than they might have been in reality. As I think many of us would if all we had was, you know, evidence of paintings versus like photographs that we can't fake. But for whatever reason, Akhenaten chose to make himself look this kind of odd way. Did he think this looked cool, or was this a reflection of his reality and he wanted to normalize it? So what I thought was interesting is Bob Brier brought these characteristics, brought photos of Akhenaten to a group of people with Marfan syndrome, and they looked at pictures and were like, oh my gosh, this looks like us. And I am going to run through some of the symptoms because, first of all, let me describe what Marfan syndrome is. It's a connective tissue disorder. It's a hereditary connective tissue disorder. I can't remember if I said that much earlier. And it has things like arachnodactyly, which means you've got long fingers. And actually, okay, I have something similar. It's another connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And in a lot of ways, they cross over. And I do have some of the Marfan-like symptoms. So that includes the arachnodactyly. And the people in here were like, yeah, they've always, known that they have these, like, long fingers and all this other kind of stuff. And it's like, yeah, I remember as a kid, I got made fun of for long fingers, or throughout my life, I've had people make comments, oh, your fingers are so long, you must play piano. Forever. That is the arachnodactyly that they are talking about for the Marfan syndrome that you're seeing potentially with Akhenaten, King Tut's father. The other thing is, now that it's not going to be as evident in the paintings, but flat feet. Another thing is hypermobility, which I definitely have. That's a shared trait of Ehlers-Danlos and Marfan syndrome. Also with the flat feet. Then you have other things like, actually I had underlined, just for this, I went and I looked up an article from, it's a cardiothoracic surgery journal. And the article is Differences in Manifestations of Marfan syndrome, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and Loeys-Dietz syndrome, which I'm not as familiar with. But some of the things that cross over is what's called the wrist thumb sign. I'm not going to do it because it'll freak people out. It's where you're able to touch your thumb to your wrist. The flat feet, scoliosis, which you can see if you look at, and I don't think I have, let me see if he includes pictures of. He probably does. Okay. If you look at pictures of King Tut, of Akhenaten, you can see there's like this weird shape to his back. And I don't think I can... no, I can't see it. Now, they do say, okay, the long face is definitely something that's a Marfan symptom. The long face, the thin nose, I believe it's thin lips as well. So you can see that's going on here. And also the protruding eyes that you see here, that's a Marfan symptom. The other thing is, I call them orangutan arms because it's incredibly hard to find sleeves that don't hit me here. That's part of why I knit my own sweaters. Or get clothes that are too big. Your arms are long, or as a friend used to say, you're just a long person. So, if you look at the pictures of Akhenaten, he kind of gives the impression of being like long. And these are things that this author was looking at when he's trying to diagnose Akhenaten many years later. How does this play into this book for the murder of King Tut? So, one of the other things that is a symptom both of Marfan's and of Ehlers-Danlos, I think that you run this risk with connective tissue disorders like this in general because there's a lot of connective tissue in the body. There is more of a chance for mitral prolapse and issues that can occur around the heart. I don't think Marfan has much of an issue with this, but I do believe they have some dislocations. So, why is this important? When we're trying to figure out what happened to King Tut, when we're looking at options, we're looking at murder. Are we looking at damage that happened after he was dead? Or could we be looking at a situation where he actually had a death related to whatever connective tissue disorder he had, whether it be Marfan syndrome, which his father could have well been the first in his family to manifest. I'm the first in my family to have a diagnosable manifestation of Ehlers-Danlos. That does happen. So it could be that it started with Akhenaten and then 50-50 chance passed down through to his kids. Now, I don't believe I've ever heard of King Tut having the Marfan characteristics, but even if he had some of them, if he had some vascular issues related to connective tissue, if he had issues with healing, if he had issues with subluxations. Also, another thing, now this is more Ehlers-Danlos and Marfan's, you can get dislocations, subluxations back in your skull that can prevent blood flow to the brain. He could have had a stroke. Like, there are so many things that you are looking at that could have happened because of a potential connective tissue disorder that King Tut could have had because his father potentially could have had a connective tissue disorder. And I'll be interested in seeing if Rob Breyer addresses this issue now that he's laid that groundwork with the way that Akhenaten looked, because I think it'll be a missed opportunity if he does not do so. Now, do I fully believe that, yes, this is definitely what was going on with King Tut and with Akhenaten? They had Marfan syndrome or some other sort of connective tissue disorder. That's what was going on. I don't know. The appearances could have well been art, but it could have also been an actual medical issue, which would make some parts, and I think this is the point that the author is trying to make, is it could make some parts of Akhenaten's life make sense. Akhenaten was the second son. He was never supposed to be pharaoh. And he was sort of like not talked about. He was just sort of shuttled off to the side, and no one talked about him until his brother died. And whoops, now you're, gonna be king. So, gonna be pharaoh. So why was he hidden away? Well, anything less than perfection was not really a good thing in the eyes of the ancients. I mean, the Greeks had numerical ideas. They had calculations for physical perfection. And the ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs, would make images of themselves being young and good looking, even when they were well past their prime. So the idea of this young man, this boy, who perhaps looked different, whose body did not react in a way that was considered normal, he could have been made to feel very isolated. He could have been made to feel very alone. And it it would be interesting to see how this feeling of isolation and aloneness might have made him into the king he became. Did this influence him in monotheism? Did he feel that he was given a bad rap by the pantheon of gods who were the main gods worshipped, and so he latched on to Aten, the sun disk that didn't get as much attention as the rest of the pantheon? It was kind of a newer god given focus. So maybe he latched on to Aten because it's like, okay, well, this wasn't the one. This god wasn't the one who made me this way. And then I wonder with the artwork if it's like, okay, now because I'm Pharaoh, this is what's going to be made to seem great. I'm going to make this normal, this awesome. This is how a god should look. And I'm going to deify myself and make my whole family in painting look like this. Even Nefertiti, who may or may not have looked that way. It could be, but I don't know if we'll ever know. But yeah, the main way that I think this probably is going to become an actual salient issue or of any import to King Tut's story is if this could in any way explain his death, if his possible connective tissue disorder, whether it be something like Marfan syndrome or something like Ehlers-Danlos or Loeys Dietz, some of these other ones where, there could be cardiac complications or spinal complications or other complications that could, if it's severe enough, lead to death. So it would be interesting to see if he addresses that. Now, this book came out in okay, it looks like this book came out maybe in the first one was 1998, and then the last edition that's shown here is 2005. Ehlers-Danlos, it's not, I can't remember exactly when it first started getting attention. I feel like it's been within the past 20 so years. Editing Talia here. I went and looked, probably like I should have done before the video, but I hardly ever research before my videos at all. I went and looked about when Ehlers-Danlos would have been a known thing to see if this was a thing that Dr. Breyer would have known before writing this book on the murder of Tutankhamun. I always say that wrong. So I found a couple different sources, but this is from the Ehlers-Danlos Society, so presumably this is most correct. Well, actually, there's the other source is, okay, there's Ehlers-Danlos Society, and then there's Ehlers-Danlos News. So Ehlers-Danlos News says that it was first described, sounding a lot like it was first described by Hippocrates in 400 BC, but the first time that it was discussed, now it's interesting that they don't bring up Akhenaten, but because we've always looked at Akhenaten as more likely being Marfan, maybe that's why this doesn't come up at all here, but regardless. So 400 BC, it was first came up as being described by Hippocrates, potentially, and the first time it was discussed medically was sometime in the late 1600s. Then they talk about it again, having a paper first published on it in 1892, but it was by a Russian guy, and it really didn't go much farther than Russia. Then in 1901, a doctor named Ehlers of Denmark presented his findings. Then a French doctor in 1908 presented his as well, and his name was Danlos, was his last name. So, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. The name finally surfaced in 1936 when Parks Weber first suggested. I believe there's actually a cardiac condition named after him, but don't quote me on that. So you go down through the years, but the next thing I find about it is from the Ehlers-Danlos Society, and they say that in 1985 the society was founded to fill a void for people living with one of the most misconstrued and underdiagnosed syndromes in history. And I know when I first got diagnosed with it, I'd never heard of it. And I worked in healthcare for 10 years, 10 plus years. Never learned about nursing school. But the point that I was trying to finally get to is in 1997, Ehlers-Danlos Society, well, actually it was the Ehlers-Danlos National Foundation, co-sponsored a conference in France where they clarified the types of Ehlers-Danlos and the diagnostic criteria for each type. So 1997 is where they started nailing things down. This book, whoops, wrong book. Sorry about that. This book was put out first in 1998. So unless Dr. Breyer was keeping super on top of connective tissue disorder news, and honestly, the conference is 1997. That doesn't mean anything was released in 1997. It could have taken quite a while for things to trickle down to non-medical communities. So I do wonder if there would be any differences, or if Dr. Breyer would have brought up some of the Ehlers-Danlos even as a potential when talking about Akhenaten and potentially even what we're looking at with King Tut. Thought process, maybe not, because we do see a lot of Marfan-type symptoms, but I thought it was interesting how the chronology, the timeline for Ehlers-Danlos could fall right in that spot where this book might have missed the boat for even considering that as a possibility. So yeah, editing Talia done, back to the main feature. So Ehlers-Danlos might not have even been a blip on the map when this came on. So this could have even been a potential, not all the characteristics are there, but could another connective tissue disorder been something we're looking at, particularly if we're looking at some of the other possible issues like a valvular connective tissue disorder or something where the spine could have been unstable. We don't know because this is an older book, so not all the data would have necessarily been available at this time. It is an interesting idea, and I'm keeping my I'm interested in hearing his hypothesis, but I'm also going to be making my own and thinking about, okay, how does this jive with what I know from my own personal reality and what I know from reading medical journals? Because I will continue, as I see pertinent, to read the medical journals. I do have a medical background from working as a nurse for years. So I can, on a non-brain fog day, generally make it through the articles. But yeah, so that will be taking it perhaps in a different realm, a little bit farther than this author intended. But I look forward to the journey. And I did enjoy this article. It is a 20-some page article, if anyone's interested in it. I did get it free. Excuse me. You can't always get these articles free, but if you're lucky, you can usually find a link that'll take you to a free version. Sometimes you just need to look for the article title multiple times until you find a free version. You gotta be sneaky sometimes. But yes, I do have it on my story graph with all the proper authors giving credit, because Storygraph is awesome and lets you mark down journal articles that you read. So another cool thing about Storygraph. As much as I enjoy Goodreads, Storygraph has its awesomeness too. So that is the Historathon / nonfiction readathon that I'm doing right now, the two side by side. Oh, before I sign off, I am also currently reading Till We Have Faces. I think that's what it's called. It's a C.S. Lewis book. I'm pretty sure it's called Till We Have Faces. Yeah, Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis. And I'm considering this historical fiction. It's about the ancient Greek mythological tale of Psyche and, well, it depends on which translation you go, whether it's Cupid or whether it's Eros. And this is telling it from the point of view of one of Psyche's sisters. And it's a very interesting story. And of course, C.S. Lewis, very awesome author. I'm thoroughly enjoying the journey. Of course, I know how the story continues. And I'm currently at the point where I believe that the pivotal moment is going to occur where you have the turning point in Psyche's story that's going to make what seemed to be a perfect joy take another turn. So most people are probably familiar with the ancient Greek story, but in case you aren't, it's a very similar moment of what happens in East of the Sun, West of the Moon, which is the Norse, Scandinavian version of this tale. Also a very good story if you've never read it. I actually like it better than Cupid and Psyche. So if you've never read West of the Sun, East of the Moon, I do recommend it. I could be messing up my directions, but good story. So I am enjoying the point of view of the sister. The characters are very well written, but I have paused the story because I know what's coming next, and I don't want to get there yet. I'm chickening out just for a little while because I don't want to get there yet. So I think that covers me for historical books and for historical fiction. Next time, I hope to talk a little bit more about, for my people who read fantasy or things like that, I do want to go over restarting the Sword of Shannara trilogy. I'm not very far along, so I do want to get farther along before I start discussing this again. But Vinod, I'm looking at you particularly, buddy. I have picked this up again. I am going to make a video for you at some point about this. So yeah, I think that's it for right now. Thank you very much for joining me for Talia Nerds Out for my booktube here. If you've been able to put up with all my very vocal opinions and don't mind coming back again later, or even just subscribing, great. I'm so happy to meet y'all, and just really looking forward to this year of history and meeting other people, other readers who enjoy reading history too. You have a very blessed day, blessed night, and I will see you later. God bless. Bye.